certainly in the second-hand area, to get parts for it. It's the new ones that are getting written off, because you can have a brand new drive off the showroom floor today car, park it in Queen Street, have a distracted courier driver bang into the back of you, and the vehicle is a complete write-off, even though there's very little visible damage. Because, of course, once you put in airbag sensors and then 5 airbags and lots of other things besides, your front bumpers and your rear bumpers these days are sort of like little miracles of electronics. They've got more electronics than the space shuttle. As a result, cars that's one of the reasons, if you're wondering why your car insurance is going up, it's because cars are so expensive to fix, and what makes them expensive is the electronics and safety gear.
So the best car you can possibly drive is an already battered one from 1995, Clive?
Yeah, I wouldn't hit anything too large in it, but
no.
Yeah, a neighbour of mine, despite where I live, a neighbour of mine has I think it's a mid-90s Toyota Corolla, and last time I checked, and it had done pretty high mileage, it had never had a significant repair. That is, apart from sort of brake pads and oil changes and filters, that it had no engine, no gearbox, not even, I don't think, brake discs in all that time. So that's why, people from South Auckland tend to cling to vehicles like that, like glue, because, all the vehicles that the AA recommend, and the government recommends for being safe cars for your teenage driver, the reality is the reason they're safe is they're getting repaired so often they never get driven.
Clive Matthew Wilson, thank you from the Dog and Lemon. Not much time left because of our curtailed panel, so apologies again for that today. Let's triage. What would you like to talk about? The hijab, Kavanaugh, or the Conor McGregor fight?
Oh,
crikey! Don't. Well, I'm okay with any one of those
Go
three.
on, you go, Jim. You're the boss man.
On the first anniversary of the Me Too movement, the Ayatollah Ali Khamenei in Iran says the solution to the sexual harassment and assault of women in the West is to wear a hijab. And there's increased unrest in Iran over the requirement to wear one. The Independent newspaper, though, has run a feature which suggests the hijab is not much protection against sexual assault in democratic societies like the UK. What do you think? Look,
that's the biggest load of rubbish I've ever heard. It is their thinking. It's not about whether you cover yourself. The women that are completely covered still suffer this kind of harassment and sexual harassment and abuse and all the rest of it. It's their way of thinking. It's control. It's absolute control. I mean, I've experienced it twice myself from those men in those countries. And in fact, I'm actually going to the Middle East.
Oh, you're off on
very soon.
A jaunt.
Yes, and I can report back and tell you how I got on.
All right, we'll look forward to that.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. It's it's not. It's a ridiculous statement to make, because you see all the victims of sexual assaults and the various things they're wearing, and it's more often than not very unalluring, and so it makes no sense. And it's just someone wanting to perpetuate a oppressive regime. To be honest.
Yeah.
Thank you both for coping with the stroll across to the other end of the building.
I hadn't been down there before. There's a lot of people actually doing real jobs down there, Jim. I'm surprised. Working quite hard.
And we went past them all.
Yeah.
Andrew Clay, Julia Hartley-Moore have been on the panel. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Nisambula Vinaka, welcome to Checkpoint. It's Fijian Language Week. Madawa Nivosa Bakabiti. I'm Alex Perrottet. Thanks for joining us. Coming up tonight on Checkpoint, who's to blame for skyrocketing petrol prices? The fuel companies, the dollar, or the government's taxes? Or all of the above? The Prime Minister says consumers are being fleeced. A new climate change report is released, and the news, of course, is not good. 90 authors from 40 different countries say we need to change drastically to preserve our way of life. The government will bring in new rules to improve the quality of fresh water, but they won't be enforceable until 2020. 20 people killed in the deadliest accident in the United States in nearly a decade. And a Manawatu man goes on hunger strike to protest the council's inaction on complaints about his leaky home. All that to come on Checkpoint after the news.
RNZ News at 5. Kia ora, good afternoon. Ko Katrina Batanaho. The Prime Minister says consumers are being fleeced by petrol companies and the government will fast-track legislation to force them to open their books. Jacinda Ardern says prices have gone up 39 cents in the last year and taxes only make up a small fraction of the increase. She says much of the rest can't be explained and that's unacceptable. Ms Ardern has announced that the Commerce Amendment Bill will be passed through Parliament in the next 2 weeks. That will allow the Commerce Commission to do market studies and compel companies to hand over information, and the fuel market will be one of the first cabs off the rank.
We've got to look at what's happening with the fuel industry. They haven't opened up their books to us in the past. We're going to have to force their hand.
Jacinda Ardern. One of the New Zealand authors of a major United Nations report on global warming says the findings dispel any wishful thinking that climate change is under control. The report from the Intergovernmental Panel warns that unprecedented changes in society are needed to limit warming to 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels. It also says the use of fossil fuels needs to be almost completely eliminated within a couple of decades. Bronwyn Hayward from Canterbury University says the report is politically charged.
Governments are looking at it to see how they've been getting on with their commitments to meet the Paris Climate Agreement, and the report is very clear. We're nowhere near where we need to be in terms of making commitments to cut greenhouse gases to achieve that Paris Agreement.
Bronwyn Hayward. The Agriculture Minister says farmers are already ramping up their game on environmental standards, but there's still a way to go. The government's announced plans for more swimmable rivers by 2023, with promises to reform the Resource Management Act, identify and manage nutrient discharges and have new environmental standards and a new refreshed national policy statement in place by 2020. Damien O'Connor says the majority of farmers are on board and have indicated they want to help protect freshwater. He says they just need better guidance about what that means.
They just need the right tools, they need clear signals from regional councils. Sometimes those signals have been confusing. We need consistency across the country, and the farmers have been doing as much as they can, as quickly as they can, but the measurements have been, have been confusing at times.
Agriculture Minister Damien O'Connor. Lawyers for a man accused of shooting a close friend after a dispute over money says the police manipulated their client to obtain a confession. David Little, who's 53, has gone on trial in the High Court in Palmerston North, accused of murdering Brett Hall in May 2011. Right from the start, the police believed Mr Hall had been the victim of foul play. 3 years after his disappearance, the police set up an undercover investigation targeting Mr Little. Undercover officers lured him into what they told him was a criminal group with promises of money and other incentives. By the time the sting ended, Mr Little had made several admissions relating to killing Brett Hall and doing away with his body. The defence criticised the sting, which it said targeted a financially struggling father of young children with promises of a big payday and overseas travel. A man aged in his 70s has gone on trial for the historical rape of 3 women and a girl. The man, who has name suppression, has denied 14 charges, including rape, indecently assaulting a child and threatening to kill. In his opening address in the High Court in Auckland, the Crown Prosecutor Robin McCoubry said the man frequently used violence and threats to control the women. On one occasion, he raped a woman several times while her baby was in the room. On another, he forced a woman to perform a sex act on him in the car while the woman's children were in the back seat. The trial before Justice Lang and a jury has been set down for 4 weeks. A Lenlai sculpture on Wellington's waterfront that cost more than $1 million to install in 2006 has been broken. This afternoon, a man in his 20s was taken to hospital with moderate injuries after climbing onto the water whirler's long pole and out along it until it snapped. The man and the pole both fell into Wellington Harbour. The Mayor Justin Lester says people have been climbing on the sculpture for years, causing it to malfunction. He says the artist behind it, Len Lai, was one of the world's best kinetic artists.
He spent a good amount of time down here in Wellington, and we wanted to make sure that we recognised his works of the water whirler, which was one of his original designs. So it's an important part of art and culture here in Wellington, but actually for the entire country.
Wellington's Mayor Justin Lester. Brazil's presidential election will go to a runoff at the end of the month. The right-wing candidate, Jair Bolsonaro, received a surprising 46% of the vote, while his left-wing rival, Fernando Haddad, got 28%. They'll face a runoff because neither won a majority. It's 5:05. To sport, the All Blacks coach Steve Hansen will be one of many hoping hooker Dane Coles emerges unscathed from his comeback match for Wellington against Taranaki on Friday. Coles has missed the entire season so far through concussion and then injury, as he was hit with setbacks when recovering from ruptured knee ligaments suffered against France last November. The 31-year-old had hoped to play for Wellington B last weekend, but was a late withdrawal. Hansen says the former first-choice hooker should get some game time on the end-of-year tour, though it won't be the final Bledisloe Cup test in Japan at the end of the month.
A couple of games Wellington B, we're good. Just get back on the park. It's been a long process, but we're finally seeing some of the light at the end of the tunnel, and he's just about at the end of the tunnel. So we get through those games, and we'll have enough footy behind him, to get some time at some stage on the tour.
Steve Hansen. A missed penalty has cost Manchester City the chance of going to the top of the English football's Premier League on their own, with the defending champions drawing 0-0 with Liverpool at Anfield. With Chelsea making up ground with a 3-0 win at Southampton, the league's 3 unbeaten teams go into the international break locked together on 20 points. City are top on goal difference, with Chelsea second and Liverpool third. And 2 runners in the Cardiff Half Marathon have died after suffering cardiac arrests at the finish line. They're the first fatalities in the race's 15-year history. That's the news.
Disappointment for Nauru refugees. Just another horrific chapter in this nightmare that Australia is, and we've got to remember, really deliberately created.
A party leader repents.
I regret a poor choice of words, but I've learnt my lesson.
A divided US Supreme Court.
We could have only our second impeachment of a Supreme Court justice in history, the first one taking place in 1805.
Right up to date. Listen in weekdays on Morning Report with Guy Espiner and Susie Ferguson.
Then on 9 to noon, will the IPCC's global warming report signal a change of thinking about climate change? What to make of the hard-hitting report? And after 10, Downton Abbey expert Jessica Fellows on the show's appeal and her new career as a murder mystery writer. Join me, Catherine Ryan, on 9 to noon after Morning Report on RNZ National.
Met Service weather through to midnight tomorrow, Northland to Taranaki, including the central high country, fine apart from isolated showers. Coromandel and Bay of Plenty, scattered showers clearing Coromandel overnight and becoming confined to the eastern Bay of Plenty ranges later tomorrow morning. Gisborne, mostly fine, a few showers about the ranges, spreading elsewhere tomorrow afternoon. Hawke's Bay, Wairarapa, also Whanganui to Wellington, and Nelson and Marlborough, fine apart from isolated showers about the North Island tomorrow. For Buller and Westland, fine spells and isolated showers, however, cloud and shower activity increasing about Westland tomorrow. Canterbury and North Otago, cloudy areas today with isolated showers inland, fine tomorrow. For the remainder of Otago, also Southland, mostly fine, showers about coastal Southland and Clutha clearing tomorrow morning. Fiordland, showers turning to rain tomorrow evening, and for the Chatham Islands, cloudy periods with a few showers tomorrow. It's 5:08, and you're listening to Checkpoint.
Thanks very much, Katrina. The Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern has placed the blame for rising fuel prices squarely at the door of petrol companies. She says the government will fast-track laws to force them to open their books. This is as prices at the pump have crept higher and higher, and there have been calls for the government to step in and cut some of the fuel taxes that it controls to ease the burden on motorists. But Ms Ardern has set her sights on a different target. Our reporter Sarah Robertson has the story.
New Zealand consumers, in my book, are being fleeced.
That was the Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern speaking about rising petrol prices at her post-cabinet press conference this afternoon. She says petrol has gone up 39 cents over the last year, and taxes only make up a small fraction of that rise.
Pre-tax, as of today, we are the highest cost for fuel in the OECD, and some of that cannot be explained. I do not think that is acceptable.
Jacinda Ardern says the government will fast-track the passing of the Commerce Amendment Bill in the next 2 weeks. That law will allow the Commerce Commission to undertake market studies and compel fuel companies to hand over information.
We've got to look at what's happening with the fuel industry. They haven't opened up their books to us in the past. We're going to have to force their hand.
But in recent days, tax has been the focus of the outcry around rising fuel prices. Taxes make up about half of what motorists pay for petrol at the pump. There's the fuel excise tax, GST, the emissions trading scheme levy, and in Auckland, the regional fuel tax. Mark Stockdale from the AA says motorists are fed up with new or increasing taxes because they're already paying a high price for petrol.
They're frustrated with the amount that they're paying for fuel now, and to have government-imposed taxes on top of that, it's really just not good timing.
This month, the fuel excise tax increased by 3.5 cents a litre, and the government has further increases planned for 2019 and 2020. The money collected from it will then be used to fund major transport infrastructure projects. In Auckland, the regional fuel tax of 11.5 cents a litre came into effect in July. Mark Stockdale says one way the government could reduce petrol prices is to exclude the excise portion of the cost of petrol from its GST calculations.
If the government was to get rid of the GST that it collects on top of the excise tax, well, that would reduce petrol prices by 10 cents a litre across the board.
National leader Simon Bridges says the government should cancel further planned increases to excise tax and ditch Auckland's regional fuel tax. Mr Bridges says transport infrastructure projects could continue to be funded by reining in spending in other areas.
I just don't think they need to pile on new taxes at the moment if they make sure they're careful with the purse.
But Jacinda Ardern has dismissed tinkering with fuel taxes.
The issue we have is even if we remove that excise, I cannot guarantee that fuel companies would not simply absorb that themselves and that consumers would pay the same price.
But one economist says stronger international oil prices and a lower New Zealand dollar are to blame for higher petrol prices, not increased taxes. Cameron Bagri says on average over the last 12 months, petrol taxes have only increased about 5 cents a litre across the country, with a couple of regions like Auckland taking bigger hits. He says the bigger shifts have been around what's happening internationally.
What you're seeing is international price of oil has gone up towards US dollar $80 a barrel, and of course you've got the New Zealand dollar moving down. Stronger oil prices, lower New Zealand dollar, then the imported price of the product is going up quite a long way.
Jacinda Ardern says she expects a market study on the fuel industry to report back next year, and the government will prioritise a response to it. Mō te hōtaka o te ahi, ko Sarah Robson, aho.
12.5 minutes past 5. Life as we know it will need to change drastically to limit the effects of climate change. That's the grim message from a new report out today from the Intergovernmental Panel for Climate Change. This is made up of 90 authors from 40 different countries. Now, the report says reaching the Paris Agreement goal of a 1.5 degree increase in global temperatures is still possible, but the impacts will be severe if there aren't changes across every aspect of society, and soon. Our Science and Innovation reporter Charlie Drever has the details.
The report stresses the need to cap warming at 1.5 degrees, but says global averages are already sitting at a 1 degree increase, and we're on track for a 0.2 degree rise every decade. One of the report's lead authors, Bronwyn Hayward from the University of Canterbury, says the findings mark the end of any magical thinking about climate change.
In the past, we have hoped that technology could save us, that we might be able to find some kind of way in which we could suck carbon out of the atmosphere, deal with greenhouse gases. This report is pretty unequivocal. It says the climate is changing now. We can already see it now.
Coral reefs are likely to be largely decimated by the temperature rise. Between 70 to 90% of coral reefs will be destroyed at 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels, or more than 99% at 2 degrees of warming. Dr. Hayward says capping warming to 1.5 degrees will improve the impacts of sea level rise and other environmental impacts to global communities.
We would have been able to at least reduce by about 10 centimetres what we expected the sea level to rise by the end of the century, and that would affect, they estimate, around about 10 million people who are living in coastal communities. On top of that, we're looking at about 420 million people who might be affected by heat stress once we get over 2 degrees.
She says the report shows the world is nowhere near where we need to be to deal with climate change. The deputy editor of the Climatic Change Journal, Jim Salinger, says New Zealand has warmed more than the global average of 1 degree.
I've calculated back how much warming New Zealand's had since 1867 to 1900, with that period, and we've had 1.2 degrees centigrade, so we're 80% of the way there.
Dr. Salinger says the report also highlighted the need to drastically reduce our methane emissions and the need to do more work on sea level rise adaptation. The Minister for Climate Change, James Shaw, says the report isn't great reading, but the one glimmer of hope is the government's zero carbon bill.
I'm comfortable the work that we are doing will ensure that, where the zero carbon bill lands and the course of action that we subsequently take will be consistent with what this particular report is suggesting that countries need to do.
James Shaw says it's important to remember this is a global report on what needs to happen over the next 30 years.
The question then is, what is the portion of that each country will need to do? And that is one of the things that, we are exploring in some depth here, is to say, well, what is New Zealand's share of responsibility for that global pool of methane?
Mr. Shaw says work on a nationwide adaptation plan and risk assessment for rising sea level rise will begin soon. But ultimately, he believes New Zealand is ready to meet its responsibilities under the Paris Agreement. For Checkpoint, Ko Charlie Drever, TNA.
It's 16 minutes past 5. The Prime Minister says she was appalled to find out government officials were shopping out access to New Zealand's fresh water to overseas companies. That revelation's prompted calls from anti-water bottling campaigners for assurances that it's no longer happening. Jacinda Ardern was similarly affronted, holding up a document from July 2005 this afternoon listing the aquifers that New Zealand Trade and Enterprise had, for all intents and purposes, put up for sale. Political reporter Gia Garrick filed this report.
West Coast Franz Josef was listed as one of the pristine glaciers that overseas investors might come and want to take a stake in. I find it incredible that we would have been in that position in 2015 and absolutely unacceptable.
Earlier this year, Chinese company Nongfu Spring was given approval to expand its Otakiri Springs water bottling plant near Whakatane. In its application, released under the Official Information Act, the company said it had been actively encouraged to buy a facility by New Zealand officials in 2015. Jacinda Ardern says that would not happen under her watch.
The notion that a past government would have instead been promoting it when we're trying to discourage people from investing in that way for the purposes of exporting overseas seems incredible to me.
NZT's role, though, is to promote opportunities in New Zealand. Do you not see bottling freshwater as an opportunity?
No, I do not.
But the National Party Environment spokesperson Scott Simpson, a minister in the previous government, is of the view that was just NZTE doing its job.
NZTE is briefed with improving trade and export enterprises for New Zealand, so I guess it doesn't surprise me that they've been looking along those sorts of lines.
In the same breath, Mr Simpson criticised the government's new 5-year plan to make rivers more swimmable as nothing more than hot air.
This new government, they've taken 12 months to effectively give us a plan that was going to take 4 or 5 years to implement. Now, I don't think that's moving fast or quickly, and actually it was really underwhelming.
The government today announced changes to the Resource Management Act to amend consenting processes and ensure stronger environmental enforcement in a year. It says it will have a new national environmental standard and a new national policy statement by 2020. And it's also talking of managing nutrient discharge allocation and identifying at-risk catchments. Before that happens, though, the government's promised lengthy consultation with interested parties, namely farmers. But the Environment Minister, David Parker, says by 2023, his plan will mean more rivers New Zealanders will be able to swim in.
It's just wrong that at the moment some people can't pop down to their local river and put their head under in summer without risk getting cropped.
Federated Farmers National Water spokesperson Chris Allen says farmers are on board. They just want the government to work with them on a time frame.
Not just take the urban vote, they've got to take the rural vote as well. You don't have to be a rocket scientist to work. Over the last 10 years there's been huge investment on the farm and doing lots of things. I'm not saying every farmer has picked up those signals, but most have.
So the government's promising change to the quality of the water in New Zealand's rivers, but is still stalling on introducing that promised royalty on water bottling for export. Mr Parker and Ms Ardern say they're still working on it. Also a work in progress and in today's blueprint is how the Crown will come to an agreement with Māori on how their rights and interests to fresh water will be recognised. From Parliament for Checkpoint, Gia Garrick.
5:19. A major investigation is underway in the United States after the country's worst transportation accident in almost a decade. 20 people have been killed in upstate New York after a stretch limo ran through a red light in the town of Schoharie. It crashed into a parked car and all 18 people in the limousine were killed, as well as 2 pedestrians. It's thought the limousine was carrying partygoers from a local wedding. The BBC's Labdor Diseko has more.
It's a day that should have been filled with celebration. Instead, emergency services are at the scene of America's worst transportation accident in almost a decade. It's thought the 18 people in the limousine were on their way to a wedding reception when their car came off the road, hitting 2 pedestrians. All of them died.
20 fatalities is just horrific. I've been on the board for 12 years, and this is one of the biggest loss of lives that we've seen in a long, long time. Colgan Air up at Buffalo killed 50 people, but this is the most deadly transportation accident in this country since February of 2009.
It's thought the limo failed to stop, veering out of control and ploughing into this cafe.
I heard this loud bang. I came out. I saw a lot of people up here at the Apple Barrel, out in the parking lot, and then I heard screaming. I walked up and I could see this large van, very unusual looking vehicle for out here in Schoharie, in the bushes and really wrecked, hit a tree.
It's still not clear why the driver apparently lost control or the exact cause of the accident. Investigators are expected to be on the ground for at least 5 days. The victims won't be officially named until all of their families are informed.
Labdor Diseko reporting there for the BBC at 5:21. We're going to Manawatu now, where local man George Griffiths has started a hunger strike after a long-running dispute with the District Council over his leaky home. Mr Griffiths and his partner Leslie Thomas bought their home halfway up the Ruahine Ranges in Pohangina Valley 4.5 years ago. It was to be the couple's forever home and a retreat for people who suffer from depression. They did the usual checks before they purchased it, including getting a building inspection. But they started noticing a myriad of issues with the house shortly after they moved in. They say a subsequent inspection revealed it wasn't built according to plans, but the council issued a Code of Compliance certificate anyway. After years of meetings with the council, they say they've been told their only option now is to take the council to court, something that they just can't afford to do. I spoke to George this afternoon, shortly before he visited council to accept their offer of mediation, but also to inform them that he'd started the hunger strike today.
I think most people, most consumers, rely on the Code of Compliance being accurate. I believe the banks rely on it being accurate because you can't get a loan unless a house has a Code of Compliance, and so do the insurance companies. They also rely on a Code of Compliance being accurate. So it's 3 different people that rely on that Code of Compliance being accurate.
OK, George, so this situation you're in, outline to us what the problems are now facing you in terms of remedial work you might have to do, the value of the property. What's exactly wrong with the house?
Well, upon looking at them now, Alex, we've looked at the plans and we know them quite well. We've come across no foundation checks, no block wall checks. We've had inspectors, other people come by that are in the field, and they've said that the flashings are all wrong around the windows. The cladding is completely different to the design of the house, which actually lets the wind inside the wall cavity and then through the power point sockets. That's how bad it is.
So you're saying it's effectively impossible to live in this place?
Well, it makes it very, very hard. Over the winter period, we've actually moved our bed into our lounge to try and keep warm. And for a new house, I mean, that's just disgusting. But luckily, we do have summer coming our way, hopefully.
Yes, but in the summer, of course, we do get intermittent rain, and your roof is leaking as well. Is that right?
Yes, because it's such an exposed house up high in the Ruahine Ranges, the consented plans and specifications required it to have flashings for a very high wind zone. It doesn't. It has just flashings for the CBD type of area. So even though it was stated on the consented plans and specifications, it was never put on. And because of that, we get the driving wind, driving rain, and we all know what happens.
Yeah, and since this has all happened, George, you've got an independent housing inspector who says that the Kokoda compliance should never have been given. What was the council's response to that assessment?
They just basically stonewalled us and just kept on. I mean, they're very good at running around in circles. But now, I think since we've handed the letter of intention to the council, they have now offered us a mediator, but they have offered no solution. And from the letter, they still stick to their way of thinking that it's not their fault. But my question to them is, who signed off the code of compliance? Who ticked all the appropriate boxes? And on those boxes that they had to tick was to cite the on-site plans, which we have in our possession, which totally does not resemble the work that they've passed.
And it sounds from things, George, that you don't have too much hope for this upcoming mediation process, as you're going on hunger strike today, aren't you?
Absolutely. I've started it from 12 o'clock last night, and I'm going to continue doing this because the public need to know. I think if you ask any public person out there, they would say that the code of compliance was a guarantee that the work was done correctly and properly from the council. That is not the case. It is not a guarantee. We've been told by the council it is not a guarantee and has never been implied to be a guarantee, which we've asked many people in our district, and they all believe it is a guarantee. It is not. So anybody else out there could be in our situation and they don't even know it. So
yeah, I was going to get to that, George. I mean, we're in spring. We've got a higher number of houses on the market. There'll be a lot of people out there considering buying a house. What's your message to them? Is it, be ultra careful and get a second opinion at least on the inspection?
Oh, absolutely. We went above and beyond. We can actually consider that we went above and beyond because even though it was a new house, we, like anyone else, understand that it's a big investment. But they're pumping through houses at the moment. Why? Could there be other failures out there like ours? And as I said, the code of compliance is no guarantee. That's scary. That is really scary to know that. What do we pay these people to inspect if they don't guarantee that they've done it correctly?
George Griffiths there. He's gone on a hunger strike today. In fact, he started at midnight over his dispute with Manawatu District Council. We did get in touch with the council and they say they won't comment while it's a legal matter. It's just coming up to 28 minutes past 5. Aucklanders and transport industry insiders are backing a Chinese company's bid to build and pay for a major toll road north of the city. The Auckland Chamber of Commerce is assisting a bid by the Chinese civil engineers to build the $400 million Penlink toll road project, which will link State Highway 1 and the Whangaparaoa Peninsula. Matt Chatterton has more.
Whangaparaoa locals are fed up with their long commute in and out of the peninsula.
We've got a history of, leaving things just too damn long. I've been up here for over 30 years and it was meant to happen years ago and, if it had, it would have changed the whole dynamics of the place.
That was local business owner Cedric Armit. He says the drive is a nightmare every day.
I've actually got to drive out here in the morning. My daughter goes to school out the end of the peninsula, and all the way from Little Manly is a traffic jam. So you just look at it and you think, why?
Mr Armit says he's more than happy to pay a toll should a road be built, and most locals RNZ spoke to agreed. Gulf HQ business owner Blake Cowley says the toll road has to happen.
Everyone around here, the community, wouldn't blink an eye on $3 for a toll.
The 7-kilometre long Penlink toll road project has consent, but isn't scheduled to be built for another decade. However, it could start as early as next year if the proposal from China Tiesu Civil Engineering is given the green light, according to Infrastructure New Zealand Chief Executive Stephen Selwood. He says the project needs to be started sooner rather than later.
The cost of delay in these projects vastly exceeds the cost of private finance, and we should simply get that problem out of our minds and move on with the solutions rather than the reasons why not.
China Tiesuju Civil Engineering is a subsidiary of China Railway Engineering. It specialises in railway projects, but has also constructed expressways, bridges and tunnels in more than 20 countries. The agreement the company is pitching to the Transport Agency is known as a BOOT, or Build, Own, Operate, Transfer. If successful, the company would own the road and take revenue from tolls before transferring ownership to the government around 25 to 30 years after it's built. Of the 6 locals RNZ spoke to, only one was concerned about why a Chinese company wants to invest in New Zealand. But Stephen Selwood says foreign investment is good for the country.
The smart move is to plan and think long term and then find the ways to finance it, which enables growth, enables wealth creation, and then the country will prosper. But if we continue always to just work within the budgets that we've got, we're just limiting our opportunities to grow as a nation.
Mr Selwood believes the project will require foreign specialists for a job of that scale, but says it's necessary to get it done. AA spokesman Barney Irvine says while it's another added cost for motorists in the area, the road would have wider benefits.
The exciting thing here is that if a deal like this can work in Penrith, well, then it can be used in other parts of Auckland to bring forward roading projects that we're going to need as the city grows.
In a statement to RNZ, Transport Minister Phil Twyford said the NZTA is working through the bids procurement process, but won't comment on the offer due to the competitive commercial process. For Checkpoint, Matt Chatterton.
28.5 minutes to 6. Coming up on Checkpoint, search and rescue operations are coming to an end in quake-hit parts of Indonesia. We'll have the latest from Palu. We also go inside the little-known underground bunker nestling below Wellington's Botanic Gardens. Don't know if you know that they're there, but you can hear more about that a bit later in the program. We'd also love your feedback. Don't forget you can text us 2101 on the text. You can tweet us at Checkpoint RNZ. We're on Facebook, Checkpoint, or email us at checkpoint@radionz.co.nz. But first, Katrina Batten is here with the news headlines.
The Prime Minister is accusing petrol companies of fleecing customers and is promising to fast-track legislation to force them to open their books. Jacinda Ardern says prices have gone up 39 cents in the last year and taxes only make up a small fraction of the increase. She says much of the rest can't be explained and that's unacceptable. The law change will allow the Commerce Commission to do market studies and compel companies to hand over information, and Ms Ardern says the fuel market will be one of the first cabs off the rank. A major new report on climate change has delivered the most extensive warning yet on the risks of rising global temperatures. The report has found the goal to stop warming going over 1.5 degrees Celsius is now completely off track, and rapid, far-reaching and unprecedented changes in all aspects of society is needed. It says this will be hugely expensive, but the window of opportunity is not yet closed. The Agriculture Minister says farmers are already lifting their game on environmental standards, but there's still a way to go. The government's announced plans for more swimmable rivers by 2023, with promises to reform the Resource Management Act, identify and manage nutrient discharges, and have new environmental standards and a refreshed national policy statement in place by 2020. Damien O'Connor says the majority of farmers are on board and have indicated they want to help protect freshwater. He says they just need better guidance about what that means. Infrastructure New Zealand says the Transport Agency would be stupid to not accept a bid from a Chinese company to build the Penlink toll road. The company has made an unsolicited $400 million bid to build and pay for the 7-kilometre road connecting the Whangaparāoa Peninsula with State Highway 1 north of Auckland. As part of the proposal, the company would collect revenue from a toll before transferring ownership to the government after 25 to 30 years. A Lenlai sculpture on Wellington's waterfront that cost more than $1 million to install in 2006 has been broken by a man swinging on it. Footage shows him climbing out onto the end of the pole until it snaps. He falls into the water, is injured and taken to hospital. Just kind of what you would expect, really. That's the headlines. I'll be back at 6 o'clock.
Thank you. We'll hear from you then. I did watch that little bit of footage. It seems he wasn't injured too much because he was so close to the water, but it did look like an incredibly silly thing to do.
And it sounds like everybody's been doing it for quite a number of years,
Yeah,
so you sort of have to wonder, what are they thinking?
Yeah, got to breaking point. Yeah, hopefully they can fix it. Thank you, Katrina. And in the studio with me is Nana Peltier. How are you?
I'm very well. Thank you very much for asking. And
Now,
how are you today?
I'm very well. We're doing better than the ANZ Bank in Australia. They are saying that they're going to have a hit to their profits, and this is, of course, because of all the I guess the recompense that will be paid to customers and others as a result of the Royal Commission there. Now, don't tell me that we have to feel sorry for them.
No, I'm not going to say that.
Good.
In fact, the review is still ongoing. So what they have done is they have set aside $374 million for what they already know about. Now, what that doesn't mean that they don't know that there's more out there. We don't know yet how far that's going to go. But that Australian commission into the misconduct into the banking and financial services sector is still going on, and we can expect it to go on for some time. We've already seen some fallout there with the Commonwealth Bank. They've been fined. The AMP are up for some fines. They've set aside some money. And as well, the ANZ have set aside another $55 million to cover their legal fees for the year ending September 30th. So that's just last financial year for them. Right. And we can expect to see a lot more. Now, there were some other costs. They're warning that their costs all up, they'll have another bit, $767 million of write-offs, not just from that Royal Commission, not just for legal costs, but also for the write-down in the value of some old software and some other technology issues that they have to deal with. So overall, quite a lot of expense there for the ANZ Bank in Australia.
Yes, it must be, I suppose, emphasised as you're doing so that that's in Australia. But I mean, these banks are very closely linked to the banks here.
Well, they're owned by them, of course. Many of our banks are. The four big ones are.
And we've been told, of course, that their operations are completely separate. But I mean, in terms of management, you do see a lot of comings and goings with people that are running the show. I mean, is there anything else about what sort of inquiries might be done here?
Well, there's an inquiry going on right now here in New Zealand from the Reserve Bank and the Financial Markets Authority. They're looking at the banking sector here, but they're not just looking at what they're doing exactly. They're looking at the culture that underlies the bank. They're not just looking at what sort of specific concerns they may have about some of their dealings with customers, but what is the culture? They're interviewing frontline staff, and they're going around not just the large banks, but the smaller ones too, and they're looking at the whole piece. It's a little different from a Royal Commission in this case, but nonetheless, so far they hadn't found anything that they disclosed, but we are expecting to hear a more in-depth report from these regulators this month, so we'll see what happens with that.
Good. Okay, more to come on that. Now, we've heard a lot last week about this stoush between the NZX and one of its shareholders.
Elevation Capital.
There's a war of words that's...
It's more than a war of words, I'd say. It's more a matter of, look, we think that you could be doing things better. Elevation Capital... It's a fund manager too. They own 2.3% of NZX, but they're not alone in criticizing the market operator. We've had a lot of criticism, and the NZX, to be fair, responded to this criticism with a strategic report that they put out last year, and they've been working to implement it. And amongst the things they described was to develop global alliances as part of being a regional operator to strengthen the opportunities for listed companies here in New Zealand to take part in other markets, say Singapore or the NASDAQ or the Shanghai market, etc. Well, Elevation Capital say that this isn't acceptable, that this is costly, and where is it going to lead? What they want to see is the NZX getting stuck back to its core. They want it to spin off its fund management business into a private, or rather another entity, which would potentially be listed on the exchange as well, giving shareholders two bangs for their buck, so to speak. But the NZX looked at their report and said, we don't like this. But there's something else that happened in between all of what's going on last week. Well, it turns out that Elevation Capital sent a private message to the NZX saying, look, we'll stop publicly criticizing you if you put 3 of our nominees on your board and you hire back some guy who used to advise you. And they were like, we're not doing that. This is outlandish. And they've come out and publicly said, forget it, this is crazy, and how could a small shareholder like elevation with just 2.3 come out and do this.
That puts a real dent in the criticism then, doesn't it?
Well,
really,
it kind of does undermine it somewhat, yeah. And the other thing is, Elevation Capital, we went back to them and they said they were going to prepare a written response. Well, we haven't heard back from them today, and they didn't respond to our request for an interview this afternoon. So,
right. Otherwise, how are the markets doing?
Well, not so good, as a matter of fact. I don't have a lot of good news today, do I? No, sorry. Well, anyways, look, not least of all, our dollar fell over the weekend just because of some, the strength of the U.S. economy, the concerns about trade, and we're under pressure. Some people are expecting our Kiwi to come down to, even around 62 cents. So you can expect the downward pressure will continue. So in that vein, we were steady today, though, at 64.4 U.S. cents, 91.2 Australian, and 49 British pence. But our top 50 index, this is our share market, is certainly under pressure, and we're seeing a lot of red in Asia right now. The Australian market, the ASX 200, was down more than 1%. We were down 0.75%, so not quite as much, down 68 points to 9,147. But look, Asia's not looking very good, and this is partly because of the Chinese government putting, releasing the amount of funds that financial institutions have to hold, sort of to increase liquidity in the market. Instead of really making the market feel more secure, it made them feel more nervous. And so the markets are really concerned that this trade war is escalating in China.
Right, wow. Thank you very much for the update. The very latest there from Nona Peltier with the business news at 20 minutes to 6. Almost 2 weeks after he was reported missing, Chinese authorities have confirmed that the missing head of the international police organisation, Interpol, is being detained and investigated for violations of the law. Meng Hongwei, who's based in France, went missing on a trip to China last week. Interpol says it's now received his resignation. The BBC's Daniel McCarroll has the detail.
After nearly 2 weeks of silence, China has confirmed Meng Hongwei is being held in their custody. Beijing say he is being investigated by the country's anti-corruption body for unspecified breaches of the law. Soon after that announcement, Interpol said it had received Mr. Meng's resignation as president with immediate effect. Meng Hongwei's family have not heard from him since the 25th of September, when he flew to China from the French city of Lyon, where Interpol is based. The last message his wife received was the image of a knife, which she says signified danger. Grace Meng has given a tearful press conference with her back to the cameras to avoid being identified. Speaking in both Mandarin and English, she asked for the international community to intervene.
Although I can't see my husband, we are always connected by heart. He will support me doing this. The matter belongs to the fairness and justice. The matter belongs to the international community. The matter belongs to the people of my motherland.
Beijing says Meng Hongwei is being investigated by the National Supervisory Commission, which was set up earlier this year to combat corrupt public servants. He is the latest high-profile disappearance in China, where a number of top government officials, billionaires, and even an A-list celebrity have vanished in recent months. Earlier this week, actress Fan Bingbing, who disappeared in China in July, emerged with a public apology and a fine of 883 million yuan, £98.9 million for tax evasion and other offences. Meng Hongwei was once in the centre of international law enforcement, but he has now fallen foul of laws at home. How long it will be until he is released and at what cost is still far from clear.
Daniel McCarroll reporting there at 17 minutes to 6. To Indonesia now, where disaster officials will end operations to search for the victims of the devastating earthquake and tsunami in the Indonesian island of Sulawesi later in the week. The decision has been met with both anger and resignation, with more than 5,000 people still missing. So far, 1,700 bodies have been recovered. But of course, there's fears that the two worst affected neighbourhoods in the city of Palu may contain thousands more victims. The BBC's Howell Griffiths is in Palu and has this report.
Slowly, some sort of normality is coming back to Sulawesi, a basic economy of the bare essentials. The Indonesian government has told people they must start thinking about the future. But how do you do that when everything you own has been swept away? 15-year-old Gufari and his father are hoping to salvage something from their home. But it's hard after the house was carried 400 metres by a mudslide.
I saw it from the distance. I was afraid. I was sad. I was searching around trying to find my mom and my sisters.
His mother was found alive, but his sister and his niece were both killed in Patobo's mudslide. 500 families used to live here. So far, they found at least 300 bodies. But in reality, they may never be able to know exactly how many people were trapped in this mud. The Indonesian government has announced it will end search and rescue operations on Thursday. It's likely Patobo will then be declared a mass grave. Nearby, this school isn't ready to reopen, but emergency tent classrooms could be set up this week. For Gufari and his father, planning a future is still difficult, but they are desperate to try to rebuild their lives.
The BBC's Hywel Griffiths reporting at 5:45. The Crown says a fielding man deliberately shot his friend Brett Hall after a dispute over money and had made a plan to get away with murder. David Little, 53, has been charged with the Whanganui man's murder. However, his lawyers have told a jury at the High Court in Palmerston North that Mr Little was not connected with Mr Hall's death. Instead, they're pointing at the finger who they say are Mr Hall's drug-dealing associates. They accuse the police of manipulating Mr Little through an elaborate police undercover operation designed to gain a confession. Now, our reporter Anne-Marie May has been at the High Court in Palmerston North and joins us now. Good evening, Anne-Marie.
Hello there.
Now, what has the jury heard about Brett Hall's death?
Well, the Crown prosecutor, Michelle Wilkinson-Smith, said that Brett Hall had asked David Little to build him a house at a remote property up the Whanganui River. She said David Little was in financial difficulty and couldn't meet his mortgage payments, and he'd used the money that Brett Hall gave him for materials for his own purposes. He'd also been given $36,000 from another couple who wanted a house built, and that had also gone on his day-to-day living expenses. Ms Wilkinson-Smith said that late in 2011 the men argued at that remote property. David Little shot Brett Hall. When he couldn't carry the body away, he cut it up in pieces, put it in plastic bags, and 2 days later, she said he buried the remains at a beach south of Whanganui. CCTV footage, she said, showed him early that Sunday morning driving up and down several roads, and the Crown says that was him trying to find a way to get to the beach.
Right. So, Anne-Marie, of course, the defence are saying, well, they're actually accusing police of manipulating their client in order to gain a confession. What are you hearing about that sort of alleged undercover sting?
Well, the Crown, Michelle Wilkinson-Smith, said the police believed Brett Hall had been a victim of foul play, but after an extensive investigation in 2011, they couldn't find a body, they had no forensic evidence, so they decided in 2014 to set up this intricate sort of scenario. So David Little was approached by some people who told him they were part of this criminal group which needed some jobs done. And an officer, Nick, which isn't his real name, befriended Mr Little, spoke to him about membership and said, well, it's all subject of you being honest about any problems you've had with the police. And the subject of Brett Hall's death came up, and eventually Scott, again not the guy's real name, who was sort of the Mr Big of the organisation, said, why do you think you're a suspect? And Michelle Wilkinson-Smith said that with little prompting, David Little said he'd shot Brett Hall in the head, put a plastic bag over his head to suffocate him, and went on to describe cutting up the body. Mr Little told these people that he thought were members of a criminal group that he had buried Brett Hall in 2 different places. He'd done it in pitch black darkness and wouldn't be able to find the body again. And then he was arrested, of course, a short time later.
Right, so these are pretty strong accusations, of course. How did the defence respond to them?
Well, the defence lawyer, Christopher Stevenson, said that what David Little told the police in that undercover scenario wasn't actually a confession at all. He said it was just a ridiculous made-up story that this guy gave to undercover officers who'd manipulated him. Mr Stevenson said they'd offered his client, who was a struggling father of young children, the chance of a big payday, perhaps overseas travel, life-changing sort of stuff. He said his client didn't admit involvement in Brett Hall's death with little prompting as the Crown said. He said straight away he had nothing to do with it, but those in the so-called gang made it clear to him that that wasn't an acceptable answer, and he wouldn't be able to be involved unless he did admit this. Mr. Stevenson said Brett Hall had previously been involved with drugs and had used methamphetamine. He'd been dealing with serious criminals, and he suggested they might be responsible for Mr. Hall's death.
Right, and all this, of course, happening at the High Court in Palmerston North. Anne-Marie, just before we go, any idea how long this trial's due to run?
Well, apparently about 10 weeks, I understand. Of course, it's all up in the air, but there's 60 witnesses that the Crown is going to call. There may well be some defence witnesses. So the jury today were told that they've got quite a long haul ahead of them.
Right, OK. Well, thank you. Thanks for the latest there from the Palmerston North, the High Court in Palmerston North. Just coming up to 10 minutes to 6. An iconic artwork by the infamous British street artist Banksy could be worth more than the £1 million it sold for after it self-destructed just moments after auction. This story's been around today. No doubt many of you have seen the footage of the picture shredding itself, really, in its own frame. The anonymous artist, of course, well, the painting by the artist sold at London's famous Sotheby's auction house at the weekend, but the bidders were shocked when it slipped through the shredder placed in the bottom of the frame. CNN's Linda Kincaid has the detail.
Moments after a buyer placed the $1.4 million winning bid on this famous Banksy artwork, a stunt like no other. The iconic image known as Girl with a Balloon self-destructs. The artist delighting in the moment, in real time, on his Instagram account, writing, going, going, gone. A shredder built into the frame rips the piece into strips at Sotheby's auction house in London. Banksy says he added the shredder to the picture years ago just in case it was ever auctioned off. It's not clear how the shredder was activated or how this will affect the art's value. Could it be worth more now?
Well, that'll be sad if it is.
Will Ellsworth-Jones, author of Banksy, the man behind the wall, says the artist has a clear message.
It was a sort of protest against the way his paintings have been monetized. It's become, how much does a Banksy make? How much is it worth, rather than a painting.
Banksy is known for using the element of surprise to make a point, like the time he brought a truck of stuffed animals into New York's meatpacking district, squeaking for help. Or when he pointed a finger of privilege by painting a butler serving a young graffiti artist on a wall in the Bronx. In a statement, Sotheby's auction house said, "We've been Banksy'd."
Linda Kincaid reporting there at 8 minutes to 6. The Crown says a man now in his 70s used violence and threats when he raped three women and a child. The man, who has name suppression, has denied 14 charges, including rape, indecently assaulting a child and threatening to kill. Most of the charges date back to the 1970s. The trial before Justice Lang and a jury has been set down for 4 weeks. Our reporter Edward Gay filed this report.
In his opening address, the Crown Prosecutor Robin McCoubrey told the jurors they'll hear evidence from 4 women who will tell them they were raped by the same man 4 decades ago. The first was sitting in her boarding house room with her baby asleep in a cot in the corner.
One night she was minding her own business, doing her knitting in the room, when there was a knock at the door.
The man introduced himself and used his name.
She was frightened and she hid under the bed. He broke through one of the door panels in her room, pushed his arm through, reached around and unlocked the door.
The woman says she stayed hidden and the man eventually left. She went down to the communal kitchen and called the police. Mr McCoubrey said the police did show up and assured her she was safe before leaving, but a short while later the man returned.
He hit her a number of times around the face, and then he walked her down through a number of streets in Wellington, down to a hotel, down near Courtney Place, for those of you who know Wellington, where he wanted to have dinner with her. And along the way she was told not to react, she was told to behave herself, or she'd be dead meat.
The woman said she was raped repeatedly that night, which she described as horrific and the longest night in her life. In her evidence played to the court today, she said she kept quiet through fear and could no longer look after her daughter. Her daughter was eventually adopted out and later took her own life. The woman said she only had the courage to come forward after support from her counsellor. Mr Makubri said a second woman met the man after answering a personal advertisement in the newspaper.
That's something of a little theme, perhaps, in this case. And of course, in the days long before the internet, long before Tinder, long before anything like that, that was one common way in which people met one another.
Mr Makubri said the man invited her over with 2 other people, but when the other 2 left, things turned nasty.
He then twisted her arm up behind her back and punched her a number of times. He told her to go to the bedroom and take her clothes off.
The woman said she was raped and remembered being given a drink.
He also forced her to drink a drink that tasted of lime, which appeared to her to have the immediate effect of making her feel like she was floating or not in control of herself.
The following morning, as she was leaving, she said the man asked her if she would like to come back. She went to the police, but the paperwork was lost.
For whatever reason, though, as I say, there is no paperwork in relation to that 1976 complaint. It may be that attitudes in New Zealand and in fact the whole world have changed wildly from the mid-1970s until today. It may be that a complaint made to police would be treated very differently in 2018.
The other 2 complainants are a mother and daughter who the man moved in with. Mr Makubri said the man frequently threatened the mother with violence and on one occasion made her perform a sex act in front of her children in a car. The abuse happened over 4 weeks. The man's alleged to have raped the mother repeatedly and also sexually abused one of her daughters.
She was scared to try and get rid of him, but eventually she did summon up the courage and ask him to leave.
Mr Makubri said aside from the mother and daughter, the complainants lived in different parts of the country and didn't know each other.
But right at the outset, I just ask you to bear this in mind. Just because something happened a long time ago doesn't mean it didn't happen.
One of the man's lawyers, Linda Drummond, said in her opening address that her client denies all the allegations.
Now, my friend from the Crown said that just because something happened 46 years ago does not mean that it did not happen. And the same goes the other way. Just because something happened, someone says something happened 46 years ago, does not mean that it in fact did.
She encouraged the jurors to keep an open mind. Mo te hōtaka o te ahi, ko Edward Gayahau.
4 minutes to 6. The parents of the Top twins are celebrating their daughter's double damehood. Linda and Jules Top were recognised in the Queen's Birthday Honours for their contribution to entertainment. The well-known musicians, entertainers and activists were honoured during an all-women ceremony in Auckland to mark 125 years since New Zealand women won the right to vote. Eva Corlett spoke to the parents of the Top twins, Jean and Peter, at Government House today, where she discovered the twins are full of hidden talents. But first, she asked if Jean and Peter ever saw their daughter's honours coming.
Never in your sweet life. No, I could not ever see this coming, but they've succeeded far beyond all our expectations. You know, this is the highest award they can have, and it just makes us so proud as a family that their brother is. He's a singer. He loves singing, but he doesn't like the stage work. But he's got a good voice too, and we've been an extremely happy family all through. They've never caused us any strife or dishonour or anything like that. So it's been lovely.
And I mean, aside from all of this sort of influence and fame and this honour today, is there any other particular moment you're most proud of? Is there anything you can distinguish?
Well, when they got their first award, that was really something too, quite unexpected. But they're dames now, but they will never change in their natures. They'll always be the country girls that we brought up. And I appreciate the fact that they're like that. It's just wonderful.
Fabulous.
I think there was another occasion where we were very proud of them too, was when they were going to high school, that they were very, very good at athletics. And that hasn't sort of cropped up very many times. But I can distinctly remember we attended the school annual athletics, and I think from memory that Julie won the 400 metre and Linda won the 800 metre. Is that correct?
That's very correct.
That's a hell of an achievement.
And there was a time when we went down to, they went down for the championships, and I went with them. And we were unfortunate they didn't do a great deal, but they won the award where they pass on the baton. What's that called?
Relay?
The relay. They won the relay, so that was really something. And no, they love sport. They love horses. They love anything like that.
Amazing all-rounders.
It's amazing all-rounder. No matter what they do, they seem to. The big amazement to me is this: they can do anything at all if they try hard. They've achieved it well, and that says a lot. It really does.
That's the parents of the top twins, Jean and Peter, talking there with Eva Collette. You can go and watch that back. Dan Cook, our video journalist, went along with Eva for that interview, so you can catch up on our website or on our Facebook page. It's just coming up to 6 o'clock for the news. Plenty more to come on Checkpoint after that.
RNZ News at 6. Kia ora, good afternoon. Ko Katrina Batten tēnei. The Prime Minister says consumers are being fleeced by petrol companies and the government will fast-track legislation to force them to open their books. Jacinda Ardern says prices have gone up 39 cents in the last year and taxes only make up a small fraction of the increase. She says much of the rest can't be explained and that's unacceptable. Ms Ardern has announced that the Commerce Amendment Bill will be passed through Parliament in the next 2 weeks. That will allow the Commerce Commission to do market studies and compel companies to hand over information. And the fuel market will be one of the first cabs off the rank. Ms Ardern dismissed calls for the government to look at cutting fuel excise taxes, saying there is no guarantee fuel companies wouldn't simply absorb the cost, leaving customers paying the same prices. One of the New Zealand authors of an international global warming report says urgent action needs to be taken within the next 10 years. A report from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has stressed all aspects of society will need to undergo unprecedented change to limit warming to 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels. Among the findings, global emissions of CO2 need to decline by 45% by 2020 from 2010 levels. Bronwyn Hayward of the University of Canterbury says the report shows the world is nowhere near where it needs to be to achieve the Paris Agreement. The Prime Minister says officials effectively putting New Zealand's fresh water up for sale will not happen under the coalition government. In 2015, New Zealand Trade and Enterprise contacted the Chinese bottling giant Nongfu Spring and similar companies around the world about potentially investing in local water businesses. That revelation has prompted calls from anti-water bottling campaigners for assurances that's no longer happening. Jacinda Ardern says she was appalled to find out about what Trade and Enterprise had been doing.
West Coast Franz Josef was listed as one of the pristine glaciers that overseas investors might come and want to take a stake in. I find it incredible that we would have been in that position in 2015 and absolutely unacceptable.
Jacinda Ardern. A $1 million water feature on Wellington's waterfront has snapped in two. A man in his 20s has been taken to hospital with moderate injuries after climbing the length of the water whirler pin-like pole, causing it to snap. The man and the pole both fell into Wellington Harbour. One onlooker described what happened.
He was swinging on it for ages, like showing off, swinging back and forward, and then we went over to get an ice cream and then we just heard it go boom, and he was in the water. When I saw him swinging on it, I was getting pretty annoyed with him, and then when he fell off, it was kind of like, well, it's not really intended as a swinging thing.
She says that while most people went to check the man was okay, others got very upset and some phoned the police. The Mayor, Justin Lester, says the man behind the water whirler, Len Lai, was one of the world's best kinetic artists. An industry lobby group says the Transport Agency would be stupid not to accept a bid from a Chinese company to build the Penlink toll road. China Tiesu Civil Engineering has made an unsolicited $400 million bid to build and pay for the 7-kilometre road connecting the Whangaparaoa Peninsula with State Highway 1 north of Auckland. As part of the proposal, the company would collect revenue from a toll before transferring ownership to the government in 25 to 30 years. The project isn't due to start for another decade due to a lack of funding, but Infrastructure New Zealand's Chief Executive Stephen Selwood says it could start as early as next year if the bid is successful.
We have a tendency in New Zealand to wring our hands over the detail and throw the baby out with the bathwater. In this situation, here's an opportunity to get a project done. We should obviously look at it prudently to make sure it's good value for money, but if it is, then let's get on with it.
Stephen Selwood. Brazil's far-right candidate has polled better than expected in the country's presidential election, but has fallen short of an outright victory. Jair Bolsonaro received a surprising 46% of the vote, while his left-wing rival Fernando Haddad got 28%. They'll now face a runoff at the end of the month because neither won a majority. Mr. Bolsonaro says faulty polling machines robbed him of an outright victory.
I'm certain that if this hadn't happened and we could trust the electronic vote, we would have known the name of the President of the Republic tonight.
The translated words of Brazil's presidential candidate Jair Bolsonaro. The runoff will be held on October the 28th. Hawke's Bay police are searching for a man after reports a gun was aimed at another person in Hastings. The police were called about 3 o'clock to what they say was an incident between family members. They say the man is known to them and officers are searching the area to try to find him. It's 6:05. Sport. Many leading All Blacks will skip the Japan test and head straight to England to prepare for their blockbuster end-of-year tour clash in November. The All Blacks play the Wallabies in Yokohama at the end of the month before taking on Japan in Tokyo a week later. However, coach Steve Hansen says the bulk of the 32-strong squad will head straight to Europe after the Wallabies clash, with 19 extra players joining the All Blacks in Japan for their clash against the Brave Blossoms. The Warriors and Kiwis veteran Simon Mannering has been recruited as part of the coaching staff for the New Zealand Women's Rugby League side ahead of the side's test against Australia in Auckland on Saturday. The former skipper brings with him the experience of more than 300 National Rugby League games and 45 test matches. Kiwi Ferns coach Kelvin Wright says the side particularly needs to improve on leadership, and that's an area Mannering knows a lot about.
Off the field, he can be a great support network for the players, just around their preparation for games, just generally talking footy with them. And I think he's loving it, actually, being on the other side of, doesn't have to do any conditioning, which I think he's enjoying. I went and sourced him. It's anything which can benefit the players the most.
Kiwi Ferns coach Kelvin Wright. The New Zealand golfer Danny Lee has made a promising start to the new US PGA season, finishing 10th at the Safeway Open in California. And the Milwaukee Brewers have booked their place in Major League Baseball's National League Championship Series with an emphatic 6-0 win over the Colorado Rockies. That's the news.
Tonight on Nights, a window on the world of loneliness. Peter Lamp looks back on the weekend sport, and Steve Wild on his Cuban expedition to find the last surviving DC-10 to fly under Air New Zealand colours. It's sitting in a paddock on the edge of Havana. Next step, getting it back to Aotearoa. But I don't think it flies anymore. That's all on Nights from after the news at 7 on RNZ National.
Met Service weather through to midnight tomorrow. Northland to Taranaki, including the central high country, fine apart from isolated showers. Coromandel and Bay of Plenty, scattered showers, clearing Coromandel overnight and becoming confined to the eastern Bay of Plenty ranges later tomorrow morning. Gisborne, mostly fine. A few showers about the ranges spreading elsewhere tomorrow afternoon. Hawke's Bay and Wairarapa, also Whanganui to Wellington, Nelson and Marlborough, fine apart from isolated showers about the North Island tomorrow. Bulla and Westland, fine spells and isolated showers, however cloud and shower activity increasing about Westland tomorrow. Canterbury and North Otago, cloudy areas today with isolated showers inland, fine tomorrow. For the remainder of Otago, also Southland, mostly fine, showers about coastal Southland and Clutha, clearing tomorrow morning. Fiordland, showers turning to rain tomorrow evening, and the Chatham Islands, cloudy periods and a few showers tomorrow. It's 6:08 and you're listening to Checkpoint.
Thank you very much, Katrina. A key climate report has sounded dramatic warnings over what needs to happen to cap global warming at 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels. The report out of the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change says to achieve that there must be rapid, far-reaching and unprecedented changes in all aspects of society. It says Earth's average surface temperature has already gone up by 1 degree. That's since the 1800s, which is enough to unleash a wave of deadly extreme weather, which many people on the planet currently are aware of. It's on track to rise another 2 or 3 degrees if there's no sharp and sustained reduction in carbon pollution. The BBC's Victoria Gill has more.
Scientists are more confident than ever that the impacts of climate change are playing out now in the severity and frequency of droughts, storms and other extreme weather events. And having gathered in the South Korean city of Incheon for the past week, climate change researchers and government delegates hammered out the final details of a dramatic report outlining the consequences of a global temperature rise of more than 1.5 degrees, and a plan for precisely how that can be prevented.
Countries need to up their ambition and get moving now with climate change action if we're going to keep 1.5 degrees within reach.
With no action, the world is on course to breach this crucial target by as early as 2030, compromising the very livability of our planet. Melting polar ice means that global sea level rise is projected to be around 10 centimetres more if we allow warming to go to 2 degrees. Keeping it to 1.5 means 10 million fewer people would be exposed to the risks of flooding. But this plan is ambitious and it will be expensive. Renewable energy sources will need to provide about 85% of global electricity by 2050. Currently, they account for about 25%. Even with a green energy revolution, this most comprehensive assessment of the perils of climate change concludes that every one of us will need to make changes in how we live our lives. Changes that have to start now.
That report from Victoria Gill. Also today, as that climate change report came out, the government flagged new rules aimed at improving the country's waterways. Freshwater ecologist Dr. Mike Joy, who's sceptical about recent reports indicating that water quality has improved, says he's happy with the direction the government is headed. Mike Joy says the climate change report is yet another wake-up call for politicians, but simply cutting cow numbers is about so much more than reducing emissions.
For a start, I don't believe the better report story. So the farmers are doing great things, and there's no doubt about that. There are some farmers doing great things, but when you have a few percent gains from the good work that's being done wiped out by expansion, then the net gain is nothing. There isn't a net gain. So and I'm critical of that Lawa report that claims they claimed some improvement, and then when they added the MCI, the Macroinvertebrate Community Index, it wiped out those claims, because the issue is that, well, there's a whole lot of issues, but basically councils reporting on themselves, which is the Lawa website, which is all the council's data put together. But one of the crucial elements is that, for example, reductions in nitrate don't necessarily signal that things have got better. What it can signal is things have got worse, and that there's a lot more algae being grown, and the algae in the rivers is taking the nitrogen out of the water sample and building it into its own growth. And so when you take a water sample, a snapshot water sample, which is what the councils do, you can see reducing nitrogen, but the reason is because a negative thing is happening, not a positive thing. So I'm quite critical of that, and I have been quite critical of that report of improvements. But to come back to the farmers, they are doing good, things individually, a heap of them, but against a background of expansion, then there's been no net gain from that.
Okay, and you've been big on this thing of the MCI, the Macroinvertebrate Community Index, which basically, when it breaks down to it, is the prevalence of these, the small spineless rubbery fish. Can you just tell us how important they are to the broader ecosystem?
Well, so they are the indicators. Well, you've got to think of them as minus canaries here, not as invertebrates in their own right. So what they're telling us, when they decline, and these measurements are based on organic enrichment, when the species that are sensitive to organic enrichment start to disappear and the number starts to go down, which is the trend that's happening across a lot of these rivers, what that's telling us is that conditions are getting worse. And they are much better at integrating it because they have to live there. They can't go on holiday. They have to be in the river all the time. And so when things get worse, they're in trouble. Whereas these, kind of abstract measures of chemicals that are called water quality, and this whole water quality is quite an abstract idea, sort of a managerial measure of rivers rather than a realistic one. So the insects can't lie, basically, and so what they say is what I believe.
Right, and then of course they give an indication about how fish more broadly are doing. You've been quite critical of DOC and why they won't protect native species of fish. What's the latest on that, and why do we have such an issue? I guess we see other animals and we're very, very sensitive about their protection, but we seem to turn a blind eye when it's in our waterways. What have you got to say to DOC about how pressing the need is to protect some of these fish species?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's just this kind of thing that's happened with DOC's just been missing in action for the last 10 years. The most crucial role they could have is advocates for those native fish, but because of mostly for political reasons, they've been keeping well clear of that advocacy role, and there's been, there's endless information about how it's kind of been wound down in that role. But basically, the legislation that protects other wildlife in New Zealand does not apply to native fish, and you have this amazing piece of legislation called the Freshwater Fisheries Act that protects a fish that went extinct before that, 50 years before the law was passed, and then the rest of it doesn't have much in the way of protection, but it does have some protections around it. It says quite clearly in the Act that you cannot impede the passage of native fish, and that's the part of the Act that DOC could have used to save, a lot of these situations, because as well as water quality, it's the barriers to their migration that's cut out, and DOC just hasn't used this law. And their proposals for changes are only proposals for what happens in the conservation estate. So you get protection of native fish within the conservation estate. The very place where they don't need protection, where they need protection, is the rest of the country where they need to be to get to the conservation estate.
Okay, so let's turn now to the government, because they have the power to tell DOC what to do and to put things in place. What do you make of today's announcement? Was there much detail in it that satisfied you?
Oh, look, it sounds fantastic, I think. For once, it's the first time in my kind of 20 years of fighting this battle that I have a Minister for the Environment, basically saying what I've been saying for a long, long time. We know what the problem is. We know how to fix it. We just have to get on with doing it. And if it happens, I've kind of got cynical, of course, with politicians over time, but if what he's saying comes through with the right sort of policy by 2020, then we can start to see changes happen that will improve our waterways.
The timing is interesting, isn't it, Mike? Because we've got the IPCC report that came out today. What it includes in there is actually talks about the methane emissions, and we know cows are a big contributor to that. Greenpeace at the same time is calling for a cap on cows. In fact, I think they prefer a cow cull. What do you think the government should be doing there in terms of any new dairy farms and cows, particularly in the South Island?
Oh, well, I think, Alex, it's quite clear that that's going to wind down by itself. I mean, it would be great. I think that's kind of the horse is bolted there, or the cow's bolted. What we've got to be doing is reducing now, not just stopping expansion, but reducing. But there's a really, really, I mean, it's great timing, I think, having that IPCC report come out when it did, because what it shows really clearly is the multiple gains we could get by reducing cow numbers. Not just greenhouse gas emissions, not just nitrous oxide and methane and carbon dioxide, but also water quality, swimmability, human health, antibiotic use. I could spend the rest of the afternoon going through all of the other advantages that we would get by just that one process of reducing intensity.
Freshwater ecologist Dr. Mike Joy at 6:17 Thanks for getting in touch with us. There's a little bit of feedback on the petrol prices. We heard the Prime Minister's comments earlier that consumers are being fleeced, in her opinion. Gail's got in touch. She's getting in touch from Great Barrier Island. She says petrol price on Great Barrier Island is now $3.60 a litre. When you think about that, filling up your car, what a 50 litre car costs $180 to fill the tank. She says, this is Gail, this is the highest price I know of in Auckland. Christina says petrol has been rising heavily long before Judith Collins and others said they were looking into it. The real test is comparing our dollar with the barrel cost and what we're being charged at the pump. Christina says oil companies are in the wrong. Please don't blame the service stations. Thanks for getting in touch with us. Always great to have your feedback. Something else we've been covering and you would have heard of in the news, an iconic Len Lai water feature on Wellington's waterfront, which cost $1 million to install, has snapped after a man climbed up it and used it to swing into the harbour. The man, who's in his 20s, has been taken to hospital with moderate injuries after scaling the water whirler's pole, which then broke and the metal rod landed on him while he was in the water. Now, we sent our reporter Katie Doyle down to the waterfront, who spoke to one onlooker who told her what happened.
He was swinging on it for ages, like showing off, swinging back and forward, and then we went over to get an ice cream, and then we just heard it go boom, and he was in the water.
And as a Wellingtonian, how does it make you feel?
Well, when I saw him swinging on it, I thought, well, that's not its purpose. I was getting pretty annoyed with him. And then when he fell off, it was kind of like, well, it's not really intended as a swinging thing. And now that he's broken it, it made me feel pretty angry. And when I saw he was okay, then, yeah, everybody was making sure he was okay. But there was quite a few people who were quite upset, and a few people called the police and stuff. Yeah.
And did the police show up?
Yep, the police came on their bikes, and they interviewed quite a few people, and the people came down from the harbour side management as well, and then they cordoned off that little thing there. So yeah.
That's a witness down the waterfront there in Wellington, talking to our reporter Katie Doyle about the snapping of the Len Lai sculpture. There's been a little bit of feedback already on this. Steve says perhaps a Wellington Len Lai sculpture could be fitted with a gentle yet meaningful electrical current. Any would-be swinger would gain a shocking respect for the work. Thanks for your impression, Steve. Maybe you can get in touch with Justin Lester and the council and share your point of view. I don't know how that would be received. It's right on 20 minutes past 6. Saudi Arabia continues to deny any involvement in the disappearance of a journalist who was last seen going into the Saudi consulate in the Turkish capital of Istanbul. The former newspaper editor Jamal Khashoggi, a frequent critic of Saudi Arabia's leadership, went into the consulate last Tuesday and never came out. Turkish officials say they fear he's been murdered. From Istanbul, here's the BBC's Mark Lowen.
Jamal Khashoggi mysteriously disappeared or brutally murdered. The high-profile journalist and Saudi dissident has long been a thorn in the side of his government. He hasn't been seen since entering the Saudi consulate in Istanbul last Tuesday to get marriage papers. His Turkish fiancée waiting outside sounded the alarm when he didn't emerge. Turkey says it believes Mr. Khashoggi was killed in the consulate in a premeditated murder involving a Saudi hit squad who removed his body. The Saudis called that baseless, touring a camera crew around the consulate, opening cupboards in a bizarre attempt to show the journalist is not inside. They claim he left the building and don't know where he is.
I would like to confirm that the citizen Jamal is not at the consulate, nor in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. And the consulate and the embassy are working to search for him, and we are worried about his case.
The Turkish president said police are examining CCTV footage and called Mr. Khashoggi a friend. And after the claims of assassination, he sounded a little more cautious.
My expectations are still positive. God willing, we do not face a situation that we do not want. His fiancée's hopes are the same.
If it's proved that Jamal Khashoggi's life ended here, it would plunge already strained Turkey-Saudi relations into crisis and could also force London, Washington and other Western governments to radically rethink their embrace of Prince Mohammed bin Salman. The new Saudi image would no longer be one of reform, but of state-sponsored murder on foreign soil. From exile in the US, he wrote for the Washington Post. It left a blank space for Jamal Khashoggi's regular article, saying it would be monstrous and unfathomable if he'd been killed. Commentator, critic, columnist, the man who went to his consulate to help him get married, now the subject of an international murder inquiry.
Mark Lowen there from Turkey at 22.5 minutes past 6. Now, over in Wellington, you'll soon have a rare opportunity to explore a little-known hideout nestled underneath the city's botanic gardens. An underground bunker built to protect the capital during the so-called Russian scare of the late 1890s is being opened up to the public in a few weeks' time. The bunker's been sealed off for decades and only opened intermittently. Our reporter Laura Dooney went to check it out.
High up in the hills of Kelburn, with a perfect view of the harbour and any ships that might sail in, sits the Dominion Observatory. It's a popular tourist site, with cruise ship passengers wandering up from the nearby cable car and locals strolling through. What they, and most Wellingtonians, don't realise is that underground are a series of small rooms, built more than 120 years ago in case of a military attack. Roger Smith is a cartographer who has an office in the Dominion Observatory and an unofficial expert on the area.
We're down below in tunnels built in the 1890s in response to a perceived threat that the Russians were going to sail their navy into Wellington Harbour. And this is one of there's 5 other installations around Wellington that were built at the same time in response to the Russians. Places like Fort Balance and Fort Kilburn. There's not much left of them. This is probably about the most complete one, I would think. The Russians never turned up, of course.
The pit the gun sat in has been filled in, but a tunnel heads down under the observatory to where ammunition was stored. Underground it's pitch black and smells musty with the faintest hint of gunpowder.
Well, where we are at the moment, we're in the magazine, and so we've got different rooms for the shell store here behind me, the cartridge store and the powder room. Yeah.
And the rest would have just been where the gun...
And then for safety reasons, I presume, they have that some distance from the actual gun and where the firing takes place. And then the loading bay, which is further up the ramp here, and then the gun pit itself, which we can't no longer see.
Mr. Smith says the gun was never fired and he doesn't know what happened to it. He says the tunnels also have scientific significance.
We had an American fellow turn up and knocked on the door, and he said, "I'm on my way to Antarctica," he said, "and I've got a gravity meter. I need to calibrate it. I understand there's a point under the building in the tunnels where I can calibrate my gravity meter." And we'd never heard of this before, and we came down, and it took us ages, and eventually we found this little spot here. You can see marked. And I think there's also a little plaque here that says something about what it might be. But anyway, he was very happy. He zeroed his gravity meter and took off, and then subsequently we realised that GNS knew about it too, Geological and Nuclear Sciences, and they actually come 2 or 3 times a year to calibrate instruments as well.
The observatory above ground was built for timekeeping and to signal ships coming into the harbour so they could set their clocks. It was also the first place in New Zealand earthquakes were measured. Wellingtonians and visiting tourists know very little about what's hidden in the Botanic Gardens.
No idea.
Are you surprised to hear that?
I am surprised.
No, I haven't heard about those. That would be good to explore.
No, I don't go up there very often, so because I knew about all the other barracks and things around Wellington, like they're quite cool.
I've never heard of that. I live in Wellington, work at the university. I've never heard of those tunnels.
Luckily for those interested in exploring the tunnels, they will be open for just a few hours on Monday the 22nd of October as part of Wellington Heritage Week. In Wellington, for Checkpoint, call Laura Duniaho.
At 6:26, for the first time in weeks, Australians have something other than politics to divide opinion. The issue now is, should the Sydney Opera House be used as a billboard? The New South Wales state government has allowed a horse racing event to be advertised with a light show on the building's iconic sails. This came after controversial radio host Alan Jones bullied the Opera House CEO Louise Heron in a live interview and said that she should be sacked for refusing to allow the iconic landmark as a backdrop to spruik the race. Anti-gambling campaigners have slammed the move, but despite an online petition that's attracted more than 100,000 signatures, the state's premier is not backing down. Here's the ABC's Angus Randall.
On a grey Sydney morning, the Opera House wasn't looking postcard perfect, but some locals and tourists are looking forward to seeing its sails being lit up to promote the Everest horse race.
It doesn't worry me. It's not going to alter the Opera House. It's still always going to be the same.
I think it's good. I think it's great, actually. It's a lot of propaganda, but I think it's quite well, actually.
But not everyone feels the same way. A row erupted last week when 2GB Talkback host Alan Jones publicly berated the Opera House boss for trying to resist the state government's plan to use the venue to advertise the race.
I think it's disgraceful, and disgraceful what Alan Jones said to Louise Heron. That's the issue for me, that guy's is saying that to a woman who runs the place. So it's disgraceful. And it's gambling. It's just plain out gambling.
I don't know. I think it maybe will lose a bit of its charms, maybe.
I think it's not really good. For me, it's a historical landmark, so it's best that we preserve everything that is the Opera House, and not really put something like an advertisement.
The New South Wales Premier, Gladys Berejiklian, thinks people should wait and see what's actually being displayed on the Opera House sales.
The images that people think are going to be used are actually not. I say to people, wait to see what's going to happen tomorrow night. It is done in good taste. It's incredibly toned down from previous versions. And I say to the good people of New South Wales, it's important for us to support our major events. It's important for us to promote New South Wales, but of course to do it in good taste. And I believe tomorrow evening strikes that right balance.
Speaking to Alan Jones on 2GB this morning, the Prime Minister, Scott Morrison, again expressed how perplexed he is about the row.
It's not like they're painting it on there. I mean, it's the lights flashing up there for a brief moment of time, and that goes all around the world, and they do it for other things, and, you know, the Wallabies indeed, and others. So, look, I just don't understand why we tie ourselves up in knots about these things.
Opponents to the plan say the battle for the soul of the Opera House is not over. Graham Quint is with the National Trust in New South Wales. He believes the plan to advertise the $13 million race contravenes federal and state laws governing the building.
The public have to be involved, and the public is being involved here, and they're making plain what they think, but the decision has already been made. And the plan simply says this should not happen. It's very clear when you read the Conservation Management Plan.
He's dismissed Prime Minister Scott Morrison's description of the Opera House as Sydney's biggest billboard.
We're not talking about a billboard on Parramatta Road here, and if you were in India, you wouldn't have the Taj Mahal. The Indian government would never allow the Taj Mahal to have displayed on it a similar sort of event. It's just inappropriate.
Graham Quint ending that ABC report from Angus Randall. That's all for tonight. Thanks for joining us in Fiji Language Week. Ni samore, sotatare. See you tomorrow.
RNZ News headlines at 6:30. The Prime Minister is accusing petrol companies of fleecing customers and is promising to fast-track legislation to force them to open their books. A stark new warning about global warming calls for rapid, far-reaching and unprecedented changes to deal with the threat before it's too late. The Agriculture Minister says farmers want to help protect fresh water, they just need better guidance on how to do that. And Jacinda Ardern calls a halt to government officials putting New Zealand's fresh water up for sale. Our next news and weather is at 7.
RNZ National, with a fresh take on the day's news at 10 every weeknight with Karen Hay.
We'll have the ability to screen print band t-shirts ourselves. We have a tape duplicator so we can do cassettes as well.
Including the latest national and international news from the RNZ News team.
They found several people who were unconscious or close to it from